Every morning, he stood at the front of the classroom, his voice calm, his lessons carefully planned. Parents trusted him. Students admired him. In the eyes of Anchorage, he was the perfect teacher. But at night, the classroom walls couldn't hold his secrets. When the final bell rang, and the school fell silent, his real work began. And by the time the truth surfaced, the bodies had already gone cold. Welcome to Crime Quarter. If you love chilling true crime stories that keep you on the edge of your seat, you're in the right place. I drop gripping cases every single day, so don't miss out. Hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell, because in the world of crime, the next twist is always around the corner. Now, let's talk about Frank Smith Jack. Alaska. A land of stunning landscapes, where endless snow-covered mountains meet vast, open wilderness. A place where the bitter cold isn't the only thing lurking in the dark. Life in these small, tight-knit communities moves at its own rhythm, slow, familiar, and predictable. Neighbors watch out for one another, doors are often left unlocked, and strangers don't stay strangers for long. Here, in the early 2000s, families built lives in the quiet isolation, believing their little corner of the world was safe. And at the center of it all was Frank Smith Jack, a name that, at the time, meant nothing more than a devoted teacher, a mentor, a role model. He taught history at the local high school, and to his students, he was more than just an educator. He made lessons come alive, weaving stories of the past with humor and charm. He encouraged them, challenged them, and made them believe they were capable of more. He wasn't just another teacher, he was the teacher they remembered. The one who made a difference. Parents trusted him. They spoke highly of the way he took time with struggling students, how he stayed after hours to tutor, how he volunteered for school events without hesitation. His colleagues saw him as a dedicated professional, a man who poured his heart into his work. His neighbors? They knew him as the friendly face who never failed to offer a helping hand, shoveling snow off driveways, fixing a leaky pipe, watching over pets when families went out of town. By all accounts, Frank Smith Jack was the kind of man every town wanted. But those who knew him only saw what he wanted them to see. Because behind closed doors, Frank Smith Jack was something else entirely. He had another life, one hidden beneath layers of routine and normalcy. A life no one saw, until it was far too late. Anchorage was his home. The school was his stage. And the night was his playground. Frank Smith Jack was the kind of man people trusted without question. He was well-spoken, intelligent, and charismatic, a teacher who took his job seriously and always had time for his students. Parents spoke highly of him, colleagues respected him, and his students, young, impressionable minds eager to learn, gravitated toward him, drawn in by his approachable demeanor and engaging lessons. He wasn't just another educator going through the motions, he was the kind of teacher who made history come alive, who inspired kids to think critically, who encouraged them to believe they could achieve anything. To everyone in Anchorage, Alaska, he was a pillar of the community, a man who belonged. But beneath the carefully constructed mask of normalcy, behind the warm smile and the reassuring presence, there was something else. Something far darker. Something that no one could have imagined. Jack's life had always been about control, controlling his emotions, controlling his interactions, controlling the way people saw him. From the outside looking in, his childhood was as normal as they came. He was born in 1973 in a small Midwestern town, raised by two hard-working parents who instilled in him the value of discipline and education. His father worked long shifts at a manufacturing plant, while his mother spent her days as a school librarian, fostering in him a deep appreciation for books and knowledge. He was quiet but well-behaved, the kind of child teachers never had to scold, the kind that parents could proudly brag about. He got good grades, never got into trouble, and always seemed to know the right thing to say. But there were things lurking beneath the surface, small details that, in hindsight, painted a much more disturbing picture. From an early age, Jack displayed an unnerving fascination with power, particularly the power to make something, or someone, disappear. While other children spent their afternoons playing in the sun, climbing trees, and riding bikes, Jack often chose solitude, retreating into his own world where he alone dictated the rules. He had an active imagination, but not in the way most children did. His stories weren't about heroes and adventures, they were about people who vanished, about things that lived in the dark, about lives that could be erased in an instant. His notebooks, later discovered by investigators, were filled with eerie sketches, faces scratched out until the paper tore, crude stick figures with excess where their eyes should be, scribbled notes describing things no child should have been thinking about. But at the time, no one gave it much thought. Boys had strange hobbies, after all. Boys could be odd. Then, the pets started going missing. First, it was a neighbor's cat, an older, slow-moving animal that never strayed far from its owner's porch. One day, it simply disappeared. Then it was a dog from down the street. The owners put up missing posters, but the dog was never found. Some people whispered about a coyote, but there were no signs of an attack, no blood, no remains. Jack never spoke of the missing animals, never asked about them, and never seemed to care one way or another. But his parents would later recall the way he watched the posters go up, how he would stop to stare at them for long moments before continuing on his way. As he got older, he became more adept at blending in. He was intelligent, sharper than most of his peers, and he learned quickly how to mimic the emotions he didn't quite understand. He studied people, watched how they reacted in different situations, and practiced responding in ways that made him seem just like everyone else. If someone laughed, he laughed. If someone cried, he frowned. He knew when to nod, when to ask questions, when to show concern, and by the time he reached high school, he had perfected the art of being ordinary. In 1991, he graduated with honors, earning a scholarship to a prestigious university where he studied education. He had decided early on that teaching would be the perfect profession for him. It provided structure, control, and, most importantly, access. Children trusted their teachers. Parents trusted their children's teachers. It was the kind of job that placed him in a position of influence, the kind that allowed him to observe people, to understand them in ways they didn't even realize. But long before he ever set foot in a classroom, the darkness within him had already taken hold. The first known victim disappeared in 1992, just a few months after Jack graduated high school. She was a young woman, 19 years old, last seen walking home from a late-night shift at a local diner. Her car was still in the parking lot, her belongings untouched. It was as if she had simply ceased to exist. The case baffled investigators, but with no evidence, no witnesses, and no suspects, it eventually went cold. A year later, it happened again. Another woman, similar in age, similar in appearance, vanished without a trace. Then another. And another. By the time Jack moved to Anchorage in the late 1990s, the pattern had already been set. His methods were calculated, his patience unnerving. He didn't act on impulse, he planned meticulously, ensuring there was no clear connection between himself and his victims. He chose carefully, women who lived alone, transient individuals with no family nearby, students who had just turned 18 and whose disappearances could be easily dismissed as runaways. He made sure they wouldn't be missed, or if they were, that their cases would be buried beneath a mountain of similar, unsolved disappearances. Anchorage welcomed him with open arms. He secured a job at a local high school and quickly established himself as a respected member of the community. He was charming, approachable, the kind of teacher who made history exciting, who took the time to learn every student's name, who showed up at school events to cheer them on. Parents were grateful for him. Administrators admired him. To everyone around him, he was a man with purpose, a man who had found his calling. And all the while, the disappearances continued. They happened slowly, spread out just enough that no one saw the pattern. A woman who had been last seen leaving a grocery store late at night. A young man who never showed up for his shift at work. A teenage girl, freshly 18, whose parents reported her missing but who, on paper, fit the profile of someone who had likely run away. The police investigated, but with no evidence, no bodies, and no clear suspect, the cases stalled. For years, he remained hidden in plain sight, standing in front of his students every morning, teaching about the past while carefully ensuring no one ever uncovered his own. He attended PTA meetings, shook hands with parents, and reassured them that their children were safe under his guidance. He had perfected the performance, slipping seamlessly between the roles of devoted teacher and something far more terrifying. And by the time the truth finally began to surface, by the time investigators started to connect the dots, it was already too late. The bodies had long since been buried. The secrets had been carefully erased. And the man they thought they knew, the man who had spent years molding young minds, had been hiding in the shadows all along, watching, waiting, and planning his next move. The disappearances began as whispers in the wind, stories passed around at dinner tables, concerned parents swapping notes about young adults who had seemingly vanished without a trace. At first, there was no reason to believe these cases were connected. Anchorage was a vast, sprawling wilderness town, surrounded by endless miles of dense forests and frigid waters. People disappeared all the time. Some were hikers who underestimated the brutality of Alaska's untamed terrain. Others were loners, restless souls who packed their bags and left without looking back. Runaways, troubled teens, transient workers, they all fell through the cracks, their names fading from memory as quickly as they had disappeared. But beneath the surface, there was something far more disturbing at play. Between 1998 and 2010, the missing persons reports piled up, each case eerily similar to the last. A college student who never returned from a weekend camping trip. A waitress who left her shift late one night and was never seen again. A young man whose car was found abandoned at the edge of town, the doors unlocked, the keys still in the ignition. And though each case was treated separately, dismissed with logical explanations, there was one detail that connected them all: each victim had been last seen near the home of Frank Smith Jack. At the time, Jack was nothing more than a well-respected high school teacher. A man beloved by his students and admired by his colleagues. He was known for his charismatic lectures, his unwavering dedication to education, and his ability to make history come alive in the classroom. Parents trusted him. Students confided in him. He was a mentor, a friend, a guiding hand. No one, not a single person, suspected that the man who stood in front of them every day, speaking with warmth and enthusiasm, was the very reason their loved ones had vanished. It wasn't until years later that authorities would uncover the full extent of his crimes. And when they did, the truth was more horrifying than anyone could have imagined. One of his earliest known victims was Lisa Martinez. Lisa was 19 years old when she disappeared in 2001. A former student of Jack's, she had been one of his brightest pupils, an aspiring journalist with big dreams of leaving Anchorage behind and making a name for herself. She worked part-time at a local diner while attending college, saving every penny for her future. She was independent, responsible, and meticulous about her routines. That's why her sudden disappearance made no sense. Lisa's last known movements were traced back to her small apartment on the outskirts of town. She had finished her shift at the diner, called a friend to chat, then said she was heading to bed. The next morning, she was gone. Her car was still parked outside. Her purse, phone, and belongings were untouched. There were no signs of forced entry, no indications that she had left willingly. It was as if she had simply stepped out the door and vanished into thin air. At the time, the police treated her case as a possible runaway. After all, she was young, adventurous, eager to leave town. But her friends knew better. Lisa wouldn't have left without telling someone. And as the months passed, hope of finding her alive dwindled. Then there was Caleb Turner. 18 years old. High school senior. He had been one of Jack's favorite students, often staying after class to discuss history and philosophy. He admired Jack, saw him as a mentor, someone he could trust. But in 2003, Caleb went missing. His parents reported him missing when he failed to come home one evening. His friends later recalled that he had mentioned meeting someone that night, though he never specified who. His car was found abandoned near a wooded area on the outskirts of town. The keys were still in the ignition. The driver's side door was slightly ajar. There were no signs of struggle, no clues left behind. The police searched the area but found nothing. Another cold case. Another name added to the growing list of the missing. And the pattern continued. One by one, young men and women disappeared without a trace. Some were Jack's former students. Others were locals he had quietly observed, selecting them carefully, methodically. He had a talent for choosing victims whose disappearances could be explained away: troubled kids, wanderers, people with few close ties. He knew how to cover his tracks, how to make sure no one suspected him. And for over a decade, he remained invisible, hiding in plain sight. But in 2007, authorities stumbled upon something that changed everything. It was a journal. Found inside Jack's home, buried beneath stacks of old books and lesson plans. A simple leather-bound notebook. Ordinary at first glance. But inside, it contained some of the most disturbing confessions ever recorded. Page after page, Jack had documented his crimes in haunting detail. The way he had chosen his victims. The ways he had lured them in. The moments before he took their lives. He described the feeling of power, the thrill of control, the satisfaction of knowing he could end someone's existence without leaving a single clue behind. And then there were the drawings. Rough, erratic sketches of bound figures. Notes on different methods of restraint. Calculations on decomposition rates, burial depths, ways to make a disappearance look like an accident. Diagrams of where he had hidden bodies, though none of the locations listed in the journal led to any discoveries. It was as if he had purposefully misled investigators, toying with them, playing one final game even after he was caught. When the truth came out, the community was in shock. No one could believe that the friendly teacher they had trusted for years had been hiding such a monstrous secret. Parents whose children had been taught by Jack felt a deep, unsettling fear. Had their sons and daughters narrowly escaped his clutches? Former students who had once admired him were left questioning everything. Had they unknowingly stood inches away from a serial killer? But one question remained above all: was Frank Smith Jack always this way? Was he born a monster, destined to take lives? Or had something in his past twisted him into the predator he became? Perhaps no one would ever know for sure. But one thing was certain: he had spent years perfecting his double life. And he had nearly gotten away with it. For years, the disappearances in Anchorage had been a puzzle with too many missing pieces. The cases stretched over a decade, each one slipping through the cracks, dismissed as accidents, misadventures, or runaways. And Frank Smith Jack remained untouchable, his carefully constructed facade shielding him from any suspicion. He was the teacher parents trusted, the neighbor everyone greeted with a smile, the man who seemed incapable of harm. But everything changed on a freezing December night in 2010. It started with a frantic 911 call from a gas station clerk just outside the city. The man's voice shook as he told the dispatcher about a young woman who had stumbled into the store, barefoot and bleeding, wearing nothing but a tattered nightgown. She was disoriented, barely able to speak, her body trembling from shock and the brutal cold. When the paramedics arrived, they saw the marks, deep bruises on her wrists and ankles, ligature marks around her neck, the unmistakable signs of someone who had been held against their will. She was rushed to the hospital, where investigators waited anxiously to speak with her. The entire town had been gripped by paranoia in recent years, with more people vanishing than ever before. The police had no idea what she had been through, but they knew she had survived something horrific. When she was finally stable enough to talk, she told them everything. Her name was Emily Carter. She was 23 years old. 3 days earlier, she had been walking home from a friend's house when a car pulled up alongside her. At first, she hadn't been worried. The driver was familiar. It was Mr. Jack, her former high school teacher. He rolled down the window, his voice warm and friendly as he offered her a ride. The roads were icy, the temperature was well below freezing, and she had no reason to doubt him. So she got in the car. She never made it home. The next thing she remembered was waking up in a dark, cold basement. Her hands and feet were bound. A gag was tied tightly around her mouth. The air smelled damp, metallic, like rust, or maybe blood. And in the dim light, she saw him. Jack stood over her, calm and collected, watching her with an expression she had never seen before. He spoke softly, almost gently, telling her that she was special. That she had been chosen. That she had no reason to fight because no one was coming for her. She was supposed to be number 13. For 3 days, she remained trapped in that basement, shackled to the floor. She could hear him moving upstairs, going about his normal life as if nothing had changed. Occasionally, he would come down to bring her food, to watch her, to remind her that she belonged to him now. But on the third night, an opportunity came. Jack had underestimated her. He had loosened the restraints just enough, believing she was too weak to fight back. But Emily had been waiting, watching, searching for an opening. When he turned his back for just a moment, she struck, grabbing a heavy object from the floor and swinging with every ounce of strength she had left. The impact sent him crashing against the wall. She didn't wait to see if he would get up. She ran. She stumbled through the snow, barefoot, her body numb from the cold but her mind focused on one thing, escaping. She didn't know where she was. She didn't care. She ran until she saw the lights of the gas station, until she collapsed at the feet of a terrified clerk who had no idea he was witnessing the end of a decade-long nightmare. When detectives heard her story, the room fell silent. And then, chaos erupted. A full-scale raid was launched on Jack's home within hours. Officers arrived in force, breaking down the door, expecting to drag a monster out in handcuffs. But Jack was gone. Inside, they found a house that looked ordinary, at first. Everything was neatly arranged, a teacher's home, a scholar's retreat. But in the basement, they found the truth. The room where Emily had been held was soundproofed, the walls lined with chains, hooks, and restraints. A heavy metal door with multiple locks ensured no one got in, or out, without Jack's permission. There were notebooks stacked on a desk, filled with disturbing writings, detailed plans of past crimes, and sketches of his victims. Then came the discovery that sent shivers down the spines of even the most seasoned investigators. Beneath the floorboards, hidden away in shallow graves, they found the remains. Bones. Fragments of clothing. Evidence that confirmed what many had feared all along. Frank Smith Jack had been killing for years, and his victims had been right beneath their feet. But the biggest question remained, where was he? Jack had disappeared without a trace, leaving behind only the remnants of his twisted mind. The man who had once stood in front of classrooms, lecturing about history and ethics, had vanished into the night, as if he had never existed at all. And the hunt for him had only just begun. For months, Frank Smith Jack remained a ghost. Despite a statewide manhunt, despite his face plastered across every news channel, he had vanished into the endless, frozen expanse of the Alaskan wilderness. Investigators speculated he had help, someone must have sheltered him, supplied him with food, kept him hidden from the world. Others believed he had meticulously planned his escape long before Emily Carter's daring escape shattered his carefully constructed double life. But even the most cunning predators make mistakes. It was late April when an off-grid hunter trekking through the mountains stumbled upon a remote, weather-beaten cabin deep in the woods, miles from any road or trail. It wasn't the cabin itself that seemed unusual. Alaska was full of isolated structures like this, used by survivalists and recluses. But what caught the hunter's attention was the thin wisp of smoke curling from the chimney. No one was supposed to be out here. Not this far. Not in the dead of night. He crept closer, peering through a gap in the boarded-up windows. And there, hunched over a small fire, was a man with wild, unkempt hair, a thick beard, and hollowed-out eyes. He looked like he hadn't slept in weeks. But even in his ragged state, even with the dirt and grime covering his face, the hunter recognized him. The face of Alaska's most wanted man. Frank Smith Jack. By the time law enforcement arrived, Jack didn't resist. He barely even reacted as they stormed the cabin, rifles drawn, voices booming through the freezing night air. He simply lifted his hands, as if surrender had always been a part of his plan. His lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile, but not far from it. And then, with his wrists locked in cold steel, he was led out into the dawn light, the monster finally caught. But the true horror was yet to come. The trial of Frank Smith Jack was one of the most shocking in Alaska's history. Courtrooms overflowed with reporters, true crime enthusiasts, and grieving families desperate for justice. The prosecution laid out their case with chilling precision, detailing how Jack had methodically selected his victims, lured them in, and subjected them to unimaginable cruelty before ending their lives. The journal entries, the crime scene photos, the forensic evidence, it was overwhelming, undeniable. Yet, through it all, Jack remained eerily detached. He never flinched when his atrocities were described in graphic detail. He showed no emotion when the families of his victims wept on the stand, their voices cracking with grief. If anything, he seemed entertained. Then came his final statement before sentencing. The courtroom fell into tense silence as Jack rose to his feet, the chains on his wrists rattling softly. His voice was calm, deliberate, almost casual as he leaned forward and said, "They still haven't found them all." Gasps rippled through the room. Some people cried out, others whispered in horror. The judge demanded order, but the damage was done. His words ignited a new wave of fear, a realization that even with all the evidence, even with all the bodies recovered, there could be more. More victims. More graves. More nightmares yet to be unearthed. Frank Smith Jack was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. But for the people of Anchorage, for the families who had lost their loved ones, true closure would remain just out of reach. Because somewhere, buried beneath the ice and snow, secrets still waited to be found. Even with Frank Smith Jack locked away for the rest of his life, the terror he left behind still lingers like a cold shadow over Anchorage. For many, justice was served, but for others, too many questions remain unanswered. Investigators recovered 12 bodies. Jack's journal detailed 12 murders. But his final, chilling words, "They still haven't found them all," have fueled relentless speculation. Could there be more? Did he bury victims in places yet to be uncovered? Or worse, was he still playing a game, even from behind bars? Some believe the answers lie deep within Alaska's unforgiving wilderness. Local law enforcement has received dozens of tips from hikers, hunters, and even former students who claim to have seen or heard things that don't quite add up: abandoned campsites, unmarked graves, strange symbols carved into tree trunks miles from civilization. Some of these sites have been searched. Others remain inaccessible, buried beneath decades of ice and snowfall. Then, there's the accomplice theory. Jack operated alone, at least, that's what the official record states. But some believe he had help. A mysterious figure who aided him in hiding bodies, covering his tracks, and maybe even luring victims into his grasp. There are inconsistencies in the timeline of some disappearances. nights when Jack was accounted for, yet another person vanished. Was he truly acting alone? Or did he have a partner who remains free to this day? Perhaps the most unsettling theory of all is the hidden cabin. During his time on the run, Jack managed to evade capture for months. Authorities found him in a cabin, but some suspect that wasn't his only hideout. Could there be another, one undiscovered, still stocked with his tools, his trophies, his secrets? Was it a place he built for a second escape, or one that still holds the remains of those he never confessed to killing? The mystery doesn't end with his conviction. Forensic psychologists who studied Jack have differing opinions. Some argue that he was a classic psychopath, highly intelligent, manipulative, and entirely self-serving. Others believe there was something more at play. Something darker. Was he a lone killer, or was there something else lurking beneath the surface? A greater force driving him, a past trauma no one fully uncovered? One thing is certain, his case has left a permanent scar on Anchorage. The town that once saw him as a beloved teacher now remembers him as a monster. Parents still warn their children about strangers. Hikers still glance over their shoulders when wandering too far from the beaten path. And the families of those who were never found still search for answers, still wonder if their loved ones are out there, waiting to be brought home. The case of Frank Smith Jack may be closed. But the horror? That may never truly end. What do you think? Could there be more to this story than we know? The house where he once lived now sits abandoned, its windows shattered by time and weather, its walls holding the echoes of secrets too dark to be forgotten. His old classroom remains, the desks and chairs neatly arranged as if waiting for students who will never return, an unsettling contrast to the horrors that unfolded outside its walls. And then, there's the road. A long, desolate stretch of asphalt cutting through the frozen Alaskan wilderness, leading to nowhere and everywhere at once. It was on roads like this that his victims vanished, their last footsteps erased by the wind, their final screams swallowed by the silence of the snow. Frank Smith Jack may be behind bars, but the fear he instilled lingers. It lingers in the whispers of those who knew him, in the nightmares of the families he destroyed, in the unanswered questions that haunt investigators to this day. His case is closed, his sentence final. But can evil like his ever truly be locked away? This story serves as a chilling reminder, monsters don't always lurk in the shadows. Sometimes, they walk among us. They hold doors open, they laugh at jokes, they teach our children. And sometimes, they smile. If you made it this far, you're exactly the kind of person who belongs here. Hit that like button, it helps more than you know. And if this case sent a chill down your spine, make sure you subscribe. I cover terrifying true crime stories like this every single week, and trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming next. The world is full of mysteries, and some of them are far too real. Until next time, stay safe. Because the scariest monsters aren't the ones hiding under your bed. They're the ones you never see coming.